Well, first of all, hello to everyone. If I'm a little bit out of sorts, I got in at about 5 this morning. We had graduation at Purdue. So what I was about to say is I have a new role. I've been a dean now for, oh gosh, this is my 9th year as a dean at different places. I started in Singapore. I noticed we had Michael here. Unfortunately, we didn't overlap. He actually came after I had left NUS. Then I was 4 years a dean at University of Connecticut, and I've just joined Purdue University, the Krannert School. So it turns out Saturday was our graduation. And so we had graduation all day Saturday, and then I drove up to Chicago, and then I've been making my way here. It just, because of weird routing, it took me about 30 hours to get here. And what was funny is when I checked into the hotel today, or this morning I should say, the young woman said, "Oh, have you been traveling long?" I said, "Well, it took me about 30 hours. And she said, "Well, did you come from Australia?" I said, No, not Australia, although it seemed like it. But you know, with the connections and waits and layovers and all that sort of thing. And I do apologize for missing the morning sessions, but I did. I went into the room, I got a little bit of breakfast, I went to sleep. So I'm feeling at least a bit more refreshed. You know, it's funny, as I look around and I see many familiar faces, and it's a wonderful tribute to both Danny and to Miriam for this event. You know, I think that one of the things that's remarkable as I came back here, some of you may know, I don't know if I was Mia's first PhD student, I don't think so, but I certainly am unfortunately, I'm among the oldest, or I should say the most experienced. It sounds better. But when I came in here, I was maybe a little bit of a combination of jet lag, a little bit of nostalgia, thinking about the event coming up. I was reminded of my first major visit to Israel. In fact, the driver, when he picked me up, he said, "Is this your first time to Israel?" And I said, "No, I've been here probably about 10 or 12 times. But my most memorable time was during 90-91, during the Gulf War." One of my, and I use this actually as a story, and it's probably over the years I've even exaggerated it in my own mind, but the way I do remember it is the first night, those of you who don't know about this, know about the details of this, there were Scuds that came, and several of them landed in Haifa. Okay? One of them, I understand, if I recall correctly, was in a development you had just completed. Was that? Another one. Oh, okay. So, but anyway, so you know, the way this worked is, again, for those of you who weren't here, you in your apartment or wherever you were living, you were supposed to designate for yourself a safe room. And this is a room where you could you could seal yourself in, and you know, kind of put yourself in there, and you would tape it up. And in fact, so I was actually living in someone's, a faculty member's apartment who was on leave. He was on sabbatical. A person who I only got to know a little bit over the years, a very wonderful man who unfortunately passed away a few years ago, Gadi Harel. So I was living in Gadi's home, and his wife, his children were in, I think, British Columbia at the time. So in the room, I remember Lipa came over to look at the apartment to help me figure out what was the right room. If I needed a safe room, which one was it? So we looked at all the different, you know, the structural aspects and which ones would be, you know, the most defensible. And so it turns out it was a room that the Harel's children, their very young children, I think probably 2 and 4 years old, their child's room would be the safest one. So okay, so it's very late at night. That first night, the sirens go off. You actually feel the whole building shake from the Scuds landing. So I run into that room. I put on my gas mask. I've got my kit with me. I take the tape. I seal up the door. The window's already been sealed. I seal it up very carefully. I'm sitting there. And of course, I turn on the radio, and everything's in Hebrew. Okay? And this doesn't help me very much because although I had intended to take some Hebrew classes, as it turns out, also during 90-91 was when there was a very large influx of Russian immigrants. And so I actually got booted out of the Hebrew class because the priority was given for the immigrants coming in, doing Aliyah. And so, so I'm there listening, and I flip the radio around. I do hear Russian, I hear some Arabic, and I hear Hebrew. None of it's being So, sealed up the room, got the gas mask on, completely incomprehensible event. I'm trying to think in terms of Anat's work on emotion, what kind of emotions I was going through. But all of a sudden, I hear the telephone ringing. And it starts to ring. It's ringing and ringing. The problem is that I'm in this room, and in the hallway outside is the telephone. So it's ringing, it's ringing, it's ringing, it's ringing. Finally, after I don't know how long, several minutes of hearing it ring, I pull off my gas mask, I rip the tape off the door, I run to the phone, and it's Mia. And Mia says, Chris, it isn't safe, stay in your room. So I remember that ever so dearly. So I have nothing but the very fondest memories of that to do today, actually, is rather than talking about my research per se, I wanted to do more of a discussion of how a relationship that was formed over 20 years, well, over 30 years, in 84, actually 81 is when I first met you, in 81 when I was at graduate school, so now 30 years ago, and how it affected not only in terms of my own professional career and my perspective around the profession and scholarship, but also more broadly defined, the friendship that was given to me and the leadership that was provided. So what I wanted to talk a little bit about is in a context of not so much my research, but rather what I see are the context, the content, the context, and significance of the work and influence that was represented by Mia and her scholarship over the years, and how it impacted my life. Okay, so what you're about to see is, this is Shaun White, an Olympic snowboarder. And I just want you to watch this little bit of a clip from the Olympics. Okay, this next jump is the one I want you to pay particular attention to, right there. Now, originally I was going to say it was me. And the quote, this is actually from Sun Tzu. Sun Tzu says, "All men can see these tactics whereby I conquer, but what none can see is the strategy out of which victory is evolved." And this represents to me not only Shaun White, and the idea is that last jump that you saw in the clip. What's significant about it was, not only was it the first time it was performed in the Olympics, and it did win him the gold medal, but it's also, nobody knew that that was a trick that existed. And the significance there, underlying this with the Sun Tzu quote, is that Shaun White had an ability to come up with something that nobody had ever conceived of prior to that. So it wasn't just the execution of being able to do a good research study effectively. It was fundamentally rethinking the nature of relationships, of how dominant thinking was at the time. So just as one example, the influence that Mia had in the field of cross-cultural OB was that she created a mindset of looking at an individual differences approach to cross-cultural work in a way that hadn't been done before. And so it's not that we weren't looking at cross-cultural issues. Certainly Simha, with his work on clusters, had been a very important influence at that time. Hofstede's work, later Trompenaars, a number of cultural anthropologists had looked at values orientations in a variety of ways that were very important, very significant. But Mia's work helped bring things into a different kind of direction, which was merging really cross-cultural anthropology and anthropology with psychology. And so this was the significance of I think, the nature of a very unique career. So as I reflected a little bit on coming to this conference and what I wanted to talk about, I wanted to give you, again, a snapshot of what influenced my life, my research, through a research paradigm that represented a lot of what Mia did over the years. Many of you know, if you don't know, you should know, because I think it's very seminal work and very important, that one of Mia's first, I think, major impactful pieces, among many, was one on goal setting, and in particular on feedback. she was one of the first people to show that feedback was a necessary but not sufficient condition for goal setting to operate. It was a very important study at the time for a variety of reasons. One is it not only was good scientific work, but also it helped create momentum. At that time, now we're talking a long time ago, back in the 80s, Ed, of course, had all of his work on this, along with Gary Latham, and that there was good momentum was building for goal setting work. What Mia did by bringing in this work on feedback.
You need to move back a bit, I think.
Is it this one?
No, I think if you move back a bit, it'll be okay. I don't know why.
Oh, is it? Oh, so I'm picking up feedback on the, okay. It's not going to be easy. It's the angry microphone, I'm telling you.
You were talking about feedback.
Yeah, I guess this is feedback is feedback. So this was, I think this was very important work because again, there was a building momentum for a field that was just on the process of really coming out and becoming a major influence over in the entire field of not only organizational behavior, but in psychology and beyond, which is the goal setting work. Now, the work that I got involved in with Mia when I was a graduate student, and then later over the years we did work, a number of studies together, was in the area of commitment, goal acceptance, and then for me what was the unique contribution to my research agenda from my interactions with Mia was around goal setting style, so-called participative versus assigned goal setting. So the methodology through which goals were assigned, and I think there were a number of very interesting things that came out of that. One was there was a small, kind of a mini debate in the field about how necessary is it for people to participate in setting goals. So there was a bit of a camp that said, yes, goal setting, participation is important. There was another camp that said, no, in fact, assigned goal setting works just as well. There's no difference. And that's the Latham versus the Erez kind of approach. Now, what was interesting about that is if you follow that history, Ed Locke and Gary Latham and Miriam Erez got together and actually did a paper that became a Journal of Applied Psych monograph piece, very nice emblematic piece, where they reconciled these. And so from a scientific development viewpoint, I thought it was a very important approach to bringing together very disparate camps, or what appeared to be very disparate camps, both empirically and ideologically, and bringing them together to reconcile into a larger frame. So this is something else as a lesson that I learned, which is that the essence of science, scientific discovery, is not only the nature of disagreement, but more importantly, the nature of reconciliation and extension beyond. It's very easy for us to pit ourselves against one another. In fact, I think sometimes we become too enamored with that, where the joy becomes, oh, you're wrong and I have to be right, so I'm smarter than you, or I'm better than you, or you missed something. But in fact, true reconciliation in an academic sense says, how can we bring these ideas together, abandon those pieces that aren't useful, but then bring the entire field forward as a result of that interaction. So this was something I learned as well, a very important lesson. I also learned about the informality of it because, as it turns out on that particular paper, I remember getting a number of calls from Mia and Ed at one point, and Gary at different stages. Because I basically, on our studies, I was the one running the data. So I was the person actually collecting the data with the experiments, et cetera, for most of this. Well, Mia did that too, but I was sort of in the ground as a graduate student. I mean, those of you who are graduate students, you know this is what you do. This is part of what you do. So there were a lot of questions, and it turns out it was a lot of the informal methodology or the less explicit part of the methodology that in fact helped them understand what was the real difference versus what appeared to be the difference. And so it also gave me very important insights into the fact of the matter is that we call ourselves a science, but we're still an art. There's a great deal of art form to what we do and how we do it. And we shouldn't lose touch. I'll come back to that later on. I think that's actually a key strength of what we do and how we can differ ourselves from those in the natural, biological, physical sciences is we have a different approach to it. Just as a funny example, many of you know about acceptance rates. Our journals, typical acceptance rates of top journals are anywhere from 5 to 10% of the articles submitted, sometimes even more rigorous than that. In physics, it's not uncommon to have an 80% acceptance rate. And is it because physics is so much easier than OB? We would like to think so, but probably not. It's because there are paradigms, and when you operate within that paradigm, if it's a widely accepted paradigm, again, I'm going to try to be careful where I'm walking. When it's a widely accepted paradigm, if you work within that paradigm, the results are the results. Well, we're not in that situation. We don't have such refined, systematic, programmatic mechanisms for paradigms. And part of it is, think of who we work with. Our data are humans. And you know, humans are the funniest thing. They disappoint you all the time. Heck, if we could just get the people out of psychology, it'd be a lot better place, I'm telling you. Okay, so another area is obviously culture. And I think Mia is most well known for her work. And again, this comes back to this philosophy of integrating a different approach to the study of culture, that is, of self-concept. The 93 book, the reason, in fact, I was here during 1991 was, in fact, on a Fulbright, to write a book. The first book we did, the Culture, Self-Identity, and Work book. It was writing that book with Mia. And so I was here at the Technion doing that. And this was a very critical part of this was the conceptualization that Mia had of the self-concept as the conduit through which all culture, other macro variables are ultimately filtered through. It is the self-concept that is a conduit through which action occurs through all of these mechanisms. And it was a very important idea as well because it followed on the heels of some work that Harry Triandis had done on interpersonal behavior and his subjective analysis of behavior. The problem with, I think, not the problem, the limitation with what Harry had done is although he brought it down into this very particular level, he used attitudes and an attitudinal model as the mechanism, and I think it was a bit constraining. Where self-concept was a broader approach to it. It's going to be like learned helplessness. I'll be one of Brady's monkeys waiting to get shocked here. I'm wondering if it's... I'm thinking it may be the friction of the movement of the fabric.
Just turn it up.
I think this one, you can hear me, right? Okay, I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to turn that one off.
Very good.
But we'll think outside the box. Or outside the microphone. So the last one is, and I wanted to mention, is more recent work that Mia has done that I think is very interesting, and again, because it then takes this older paradigm, brings it into a new context, and that's been her work on what I would call cosmopolitanism, global culture, or universalism. And you know, those of you who study cultural values and cultural orientation, cultural issues, and it's a little bit analogous to what Simi was talking about a little while ago about convergence, divergence. In a sense, within cross-cultural psychology, there's been a bit of a debate about the assessment of individual differentiated characteristics of cultures or cultural communities, you know, the X versus Y, collectivist versus individualist, high versus low power distance, versus a universalist approach, which is what do we all share in common? There was some very good work that was done back in the 80s, nice chapter that was written in the Handbook of Cross-Cultural Psychology looking at universals. And we sort of forgot that lesson, even though I think it's a very important lesson. It's not only interesting to search for differences, it's also very important to search for universals, and we forget about that sometimes. And so this work on universalism is very important because it asks the question, are there in fact universals that can be used to describe the nature of what integrates us all as human beings? And that's a point I'll come back to at the very end of my talk when I'm going to bring up an example of Neanderthals versus humans. But this is something we forget about. You think about the nature of positivist science. We are geared, our statistics help us find differences, not similarities. We're not used to accepting the null hypothesis. That's not how we go about doing things. We want to reject the null. And so even the whole approach to how we do our research is potentially problematic for identifying universals. So now in terms of context, one of the things that Mia did, and this is just one example, but there are a number of papers along these lines, is we started to think about culture as a moderating variable, again linking individual perception to group outcomes. So we could look at an individual's perception of individualism, collectivism, and how that might impact their effect in a team context or in an organizational context or different sorts of levels in that sense. So now what we're doing is we're not just saying we've got differences between, well, it's an example, this is not this particular paper, I believe it's the Erez and Erez paper that was looking at subcommunities in Israel, is you can look at differences not only across nations but within nations. So now you're getting intranational variation that you can then bring down to even smaller and smaller groups. I remember having a conversation a number of years ago with a Stanford professor who, this is Joanne Martin, who had written a book that looked at culture. One of her complaints or criticisms, which I think was partially founded but somewhat unfounded, towards all of this type of cross-cultural OB research was, look, anthropologists all say that everything's differentiated and fractionated. And she talks about, in her book, talked about the fractionated nature of societies. And while that's a very important point, I also would argue that there are things that knit societies together. You can, I've had either the fortunate or unfortunate path of peripatating across the world in my career. In fact, I saw Ed and I said hi to Ed, and Ed said, "Oh, I heard you moved again." And for me, now, by the way, once you become a dean, it's actually probably a good thing because faculty get sick of you after about 4 or 5 years. So they want you to move anyway. But what I would say is the advantage to that professionally is over the years I've not only lived in a number of different countries, but I've seen very different organizations. You know, universities from small ones to big ones to regional ones to internationally ranked ones. And so it's given me a wide variety of perspectives. So when Martin was talking about these differentiated cultures and differentiated units, it reminded me that, but there are things that bring us together in common. Again, the driver, poor driver, you know, 3 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, picking me up, and we're driving to Haifa, and there I am talking to him. I'm lecturing him on Amos Oz in a book that he wrote called The Land of Israel. We're talking about this. But if you haven't read this, this is a superb book. And it's one in which Oz went around and interviewed different Israelis to form both a differentiated but also a composite view of what is Israel. And now it is quite out of date. I think the book was published probably now in the 80s, maybe late 80s, early 90s. But it brought home to the point that there is something unique about Israel. That is, from the outside, we can look at it and we can say, Israel is something very special and different. But inside, you've got all of these differences that still amount to a country that, back to the gas masks, in a period of about 3 months, were able effectively to distribute gas mask and epinephrine and these emergency kits during the Gulf War to all of its nearly all of its population, including visitors such as myself. If that had happened in a lot of other nations, it wouldn't have worked. And not just a scale issue, I could say, well, then in the United States it would have been chaos. It would have been chaos in the United States, and you could say, well, that's because there are 300 million people versus 4 million. But it isn't that. It's the nature of the systems that are involved. It's the same reason, by the way, that in China, as amazingly diverse as China is, the one thing about China is ever since in fact, the times of Mao, they made darn sure that no matter where you were in the country, there was always going to be a village that would have at least one Wi-Fi, whatever you'd call it, tube headset and one loudspeaker so that the Communist Party message would get out to everyone everywhere. And if you look actually at the long distance history, way back when, what united China in the first place was under a particular emperor, what was it? Chengshi Huangdi, which is he was considered the first major emperor of all of China. One of the things he did is he united the people by language. So he made sure that everyone, now this was at that time, it would have been our equivalent of middle class and above, more middle class and aristocracy, but he united everyone under a common language. And so these are systems that can identify clusteral groups. So the Martin perspective might be to reject the Ronin perspective. But my point is both perspectives have important value, and it's where you're looking at this from. And so this was a very important part of what Mia did, is she essentially provided through her work and some of the work I did as well, the link between these two different viewpoints, which is, can you in fact cluster, which I think you can, clearly, and should you look at differentiated views? Yes, you should do that as well. So the point is, what are the linking mechanisms? And this is where this work is very, very important from a process perspective in terms of the field. Now, I had mentioned earlier about goal strategy as an intervening mechanism. This is in fact one of my first papers that I ever wrote with Mia when I was actually, this came out of graduate school. And I want to just tell you, again, for graduate students, I learned a very important lesson on that. At the time, I was convinced that this was one of the first papers on participative versus assigned goal setting. And we had sent it in, Chuck Hewlin was the third author on this paper. We'd sent it into AMJ, and we were going through reviews, and it just seemed like, God, every time the reviewers they were critical and unnecessarily aggressive and ideological. And I was writing some of the responses to reviewers. And I, as a graduate student, thought, too much confidence. I thought, oh, the idea is to be combative with reviewers. Okay? If you're a doctoral student, bad idea. Okay? This is not what you should be doing. This is, back to focusing emotional response. They're not you can think of them as customer service relationship people. And as we know, it's the best thing to do is be neutral. So I had.
No, they are your customer.
Well, that's true. So you don't want to express. So I was expressing anger. And I remember from one review to another, a reviewer writing back, and I had said something that the response was kind of, I can see now looking back on it, it sounded as if I was being, talking down to Ed Locke. Because the way I sort of framed it in this, Locke should know the following kind of thing. Now, by the way, Ed was not a reviewer of the paper, but it turns out Gary was. And so I learned a lesson there. But anyway, so not only goal strategy as an interviewing mechanism, but also as a growth experience. Interdependence of context. This is another area that Mia has done more recently. Very interesting work looking at context, again, of the task itself, looking at things like self and collective efficacy. And this is also very important because it brought this cross-cultural work into a new venue, yet another venue, which was in terms of efficacy, and Bandura's work. And this is work that complemented other things. Finally, I had mentioned earlier the individual's collectivism. There are a lot of studies that Mia has done. I've done with her on a number of these as well, looking at individuals' collectivism as a very important particular variable. It's one that, if you know this field, Triandis himself has spent huge amounts of time on. Quite frankly, I think now I thank goodness, because I think it's happened. So we've sort of moved beyond that. We're now looking at other kinds of characteristics and dimensions. But there's no question, of all of the different cultural dimensions out there in the OB literature, INCOL has gotten a lot of attention, perhaps more than it should have. So now the second thing is recognition in terms of, I want to start with professional significance of work. One of the things that was very important for me personally, but I think also for the field, is this book that Mia and I did in '93. It was trying to provide a legitimacy of looking at cross-cultural issues in an organizational context at a time where it was happening, but it wasn't happening as much as perhaps it could be. There was some very good work that Nancy Adler had done at that point, more at an individual level. Excellent work along those lines. But it just hadn't really built up its momentum at this stage. So I thought that was a very important piece. She did a handbook chapter in the handbook of IO psychology on cross-cultural issues that is very widely cited and very important because, again, it brought together many of these streams of thought into a coherent package. And then finally, I mentioned this one earlier. I think you cannot, if you haven't looked at this paper, please go look at it. It's an excellent piece. This is the paper that's the Journal of Applied Psych research monograph. And it's important. There was, and I can't remember who it was, but it was republished in a book. That's it, the Stahl book, on, because I think didn't you and Bob have a paper in there as well? And it's a very, very good book that looks at major scientific breakthroughs and talks to the authors to find out the behind the scenes of how it actually happened. And I think it gives you very different insight into the nature of what we do, and it makes it much more real, I think, in that sense. Okay, now, in terms of significance, personal and societal, how about that? For now, this is shaping lives and careers, and of one, meaning me. So what does it mean to be a mentor? There's a Hebrew term, ima. And I remember when in 81, when I was visiting, poor Mia, you can see what a kind spirit she is. Here's this young doctoral student at my first year at Illinois, and I was a bit of a young doctoral student because I went to college when I was 16, so I just turned 20 when I went there, so I was a bit immature. And I spent so much time camping out. I mean, she'd come in the morning, I'd be sitting there in the hallway waiting for her to show up. And she was very tolerant and very kind. But she played a very important role of not only being very good to me as a person, but also setting a set of standards for me as to what it meant to be an academic and the importance of being an academic, the significance of it. As a colleague over the years, just a tremendous colleague. Helping me reflect on things, giving me some degree speech every once in a while. In fact, I remember giving her a paper one time, and she came back maybe a week later and said, this is terrible. You probably should just put this one away and don't work. And it was. It turned out it was a bad paper. It just wasn't a good paper. It wasn't well written, wasn't well thought through. But one needs that. You need somebody to give you a reality check. And we sometimes, because of politeness norms and other things, it's sometimes hard to get this. But you want that from your colleagues and your friends, not just from anonymous reviewers. And then as an advisor, helping you gain insight not only into the work that you're doing with that advisor, but also the future work you'll do yourself. What does it mean to be an academic? Now I want to step back for a second and play a little bit of the role of an administrator, of a dean of a school. We forget sometimes what it means to be an academic. We get so caught up in the day-to-day. I will tell you honestly, I've been at places not that long ago where people define scholarship as the number of papers you publish. Okay? And I hope you never have those conversations around here. To me, this is the very worst thing to hear. We are not sausage makers. We don't make widgets. We're scholars. It's a noble profession. It dates back at least 800 years ago at the University of Salamanca. By the way, it's always funny. You hear somebody from Cambridge and Oxford argue that they're the oldest university in the Western world. Actually, University of Salamanca claims they have the title at 800 years. They're going to actually celebrate their 800th anniversary. I think it's this year. Or maybe it was just recently. In the tradition, when you defended your thesis at Salamanca, you would come into, first of all, it was done in a big public square. If you've never visited there, the square is still there. You would come in, you would defend it in front of the townspeople as well as the academics. If you were successful, they would sacrifice a bull. And with bull's blood, your thesis title was painted on the wall of the square. Now, I'm not advocating that this is the way we do things, but I do think it does suggest something that's more noble about what is the nature of being an academic. We lose track of that. You get this Purdue stuff all over there, everywhere. I cannot tell you how proud I am to be at Purdue University right now. I'm finally at a place where it really does feel like home. When I went to Singapore, I loved Singapore. That was my first dean's job, was National University of Singapore. I loved it, but I knew I wouldn't stay there forever. I knew that it was a building experience and it was a great place. I enjoyed it, but it wasn't going to be home. For family reasons, for professional reasons, other things. I then took a job at University of Connecticut as a dean. I liked Connecticut in many ways. There were some parts of it that I absolutely didn't like. The sausage-making mentality was part of it, to be honest. But I also knew that it wasn't the place I'd settle. And as a dean, I was there 4 years, and I thought, well, I've done enough damage. I've done what I can to try to bring the place to where I thought it should be. But Purdue is finally a place where I feel like it's got the right core values. People worry not about the sausages, but about the quality of scholarship. They talk about papers. They analyze papers. The first 3 nights I was at Purdue, literally the first 3 evenings I was there, we were doing promotion and tenure reviews. We had 5 cases. We spent 12 hours on 5 cases. People went through papers. They read the papers. They talked about the methodology. They talked about the literature. They talked about where does this fit into the larger field. They content analyzed teaching. They had people sit in on the classes and talk about teaching methodology. They talked about service. They went through each case in such detail. It was overwhelming, but it's what it should be, because you're talking about a potential lifetime appointment for someone. So they take it very seriously. This is something I love. The other thing I love, and this is the pop quiz, what university, where did the first man on the moon get his degree? Anyone know? Purdue University. Where did the last man or the most recent man who walked on the moon get his degree? Purdue University. Okay, so the first and the last. 2 years ago, in the food science world, they don't have a Nobel Prize, but they have an equivalent. They refer to it as a food laureate. So this is given around the world. One person gets this. Where did the food laureate from 2010 get his degree? Yeah, you already know that. So what I tell our alum is, I'm at a university in which we strive for the heavens and we feed the world. And yeah, I know, at the business school, do we do any of that? No. But the point of this is that universities like the Technion are world contributors. This is the important part of what we do and who we are. The great universities in the world, and there are lots of good universities out there, but they're not great universities. This is one of the great universities among a handful. I think Purdue is like that as well, at least in some of these fields. They contribute by changing people's lives. And this is a message that I got from Mia when I looked at her career. Not only was it of scholarship, she did a time as a dean. And fortunately, here you do your time and you can actually stay. They don't chase you off. She was she has been and continues to be an institution builder and a role model. But to me, this is the most important thing, is we don't lose the context. So the final thing here, the Neanderthal story, very briefly, can I take 2 minutes? I know I'm kind of late, but 2 minutes. The Neanderthal story, this is a true story. When I was at Connecticut, one of the best experiences I had at Connecticut, roughly a year and a half, 2 years ago, so about a year before I left, I had one of our MBA students came up to me, and he came up and he had a special meeting with me. He said, I want to talk to you. I'm kind of unique. Now, if you've ever taught an MBA student, they all say they're unique. Okay, they're all unique, as we all are. We're all unique. But he said, what's your, and I said, oh, that's great. What in particular? And he said, I'm a rabbi. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And so true enough, in South Windsor, which is kind of a distant suburb or small community near Hartford, Connecticut, he had a temple. And he was coming back to get his MBA degree because he wanted to know more about the business, because it turns out his father had passed away. His father had a real estate business in California. So he was going to continue with the temple, but he also needed to know more about business. Okay, so anyway, a good experience. 2 weeks later, he comes back, he makes an appointment, comes back to my office, and he's got a box for me. And the first thing I said, I made a joke. I said, you really can't give me any presents until after you graduate. And it could be trouble. So anyway, he gives this to me, he opens up, and he hands me a stone. Kind of a little bit polish on it, kind of a sharp edge on it, but this rock. And again, I'm looking at this, and I say, oh, thank you very much. And I'm thinking to myself, what in the hell is this from this unique person? And his name's Jeffrey Glickman. So Jeffrey said, this is a cutting tool that was made by a Neanderthal some 35 or 40,000 years ago. They believe in France. So I'm still looking at this and thinking, okay, that's great, but why in the hell are you giving this to me? He said, the thing about MBA programs is, he said, the Neanderthals, we all know they lost out to the humans, right? They coexisted, but the humans won out, Neanderthals died. A lot of theories why. Some say it's the humans ended up killing all the Neanderthals through aggression. Others said it was disease. He said there are a lot of theories. Here's my belief. He said, now you don't have to believe in God or not, but my belief is, even though Neanderthals had better tools, and this was an example of a cutting tool. He said they had better tools than humans. They had the bigger brain than humans. They still died out. And he said they didn't have a sense of community, of higher purpose, and of God. Now again, you may or not believe in God, but he said, this is what differentiated us. He said, in MBA programs, you've taught me for the last 2 years many good tools, but you don't want to graduate Neanderthals. You want to graduate humans. That's what's missing. And so a lot of the work that I've been trying to do now as a dean is introducing a lot more around social innovation and social entrepreneurship, because I feel that that's something that's been missing. As I look back to my experiences with Mia over the decades, gosh, it sounds, over the decades, sounds horrible. Over the few years, sounds much better. What she taught me from the very beginning in the 80s at Illinois was to always think of myself as a scholar, as a human being. Thank goodness, not as a Neanderthal. So with that, I'll leave you with a final quote, which is, data is not information. Information is not knowledge. Knowledge is not understanding. Understanding is not wisdom. What I learned through a career, through the interactions with people such as Mia and many of the others in this room, is I learned how to try to acquire wisdom. And that's really what it's all about. You are scholars of great universities, of great things. You impact people's lives. And that's what this is actually ultimately about. This is what it all leads to, is it's helping us advance the nature of what it is to be human and how to reject the Neanderthal history. So with that, I will say thank you. And I ran a little bit late, but sorry about that.